Everything is connected. Ecosystem services, those are the things we get from the biosphere we care about. Those are the things that we extract from the earth that drive our whole communities, that drive our economies. Our constituents of well-being are all connected to the earth. All good things come from the earth. Now, I'm preaching to the choir here, but let me tell you, the choir needs practice because right now we are singing out of tune. The choir needs to have a language with which to speak about these things we call sustainable agriculture. The reason we need to sing in tune is because we are confused ourselves and we are confusing the people who look at us and who buy our products. Now, I'm a University of Arkansas professor. I'm not an agricultural producer per se, though I do have a hobby farm that's losing money every day. What I can tell you is, and I'm an objective observer of this process, but as you can tell, I'm also a passionate advocate for the people who work and toil every day to bring things from the land that we depend on. And I'm not just talking about the agricultural producers, because we get everything we need, everything that drives our economy and our society we get from the land. So let's remember that it's not just agriculture we're talking about. We're the vanguard. We're at the forefront of this debate. But if we're not careful, the silliness that we've been discussing the last couple of days, that's emerging from every sector of our society to assault the very things we do, will not just affect agricultural, they'll affect all of our land-based production systems. Our colleagues in forestry products can tell you a little bit about that from the 80s and 90s. Here's our other challenge, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Everything is changing, and that rate of change is increasing. It's increasing at a pace that we can't comprehend because we as a species have never experienced this. As a society, we've never experienced this. And as individuals, we're living through it right now. Part of the driver for that is world population growth. World population growth, this is a standard exponential curve. When I brew beer, I put yeast, a little packet of yeast into my 50-gallon drum, and that yeast grows, if it has enough sugar, at an exponential rate as well. Any organism that is growing unfettered will grow at an exponential rate. So that's nothing new, right? But the key to this exponential growth rate is it's happening in our lifetime. We are at the doubling stages where we're seeing more and more expansion of our population at rates that we can't understand. We got 3 billion people coming to dinner in 40 years. 3 billion people. That's the population of Earth when I was born. Coming to dinner in the next 40 years. We're adding Earth 1962 to our population now in the next 40 years. Now, my grandfather was a descendant of Mennonite farmers who moved to Oklahoma back in the late 1800s in the land run. My other grandfather was a Cherokee, so Cherokee German. I'm a conflicted human being. But what I can tell you is that I lived with my grandmother and grandfather on their small farm in Pawnee County, Oklahoma, while I was getting my degrees at Oklahoma State University. And so, living with Grandpa, we'd go out he was born in 1917. We'd go out, and so he was retired, and he'd get me up at 5 in the morning on Saturday mornings, and I never understood why. To go cut firewood in the fall because we heated the house with firewood all winter long. So we'd go out to the wood lot, take the little Ford tractor to the wood lot and cut firewood, and we didn't work that hard, which is always fun, but we'd stop it. So one morning we stopped and we're having coffee, and Grandpa pointed up to a red elm tree that had been struck by lightning a couple of years before. It's a big old red elm tree that had a crotch in it with a big limb coming off. And he said, "My dad taught me how to make an oxbow out of that sort of a crotch and a fork in a tree, and red elm's very good for that. It's a very strong wood." Well, that was a nice sort of. I was getting an undergraduate degree in agronomy at the time, so I understood the context of animal agriculture and mechanized agriculture. So I understood that my grandfather was describing to me, in essence, a 10,000-year-old human technology that he had learned from his father. Then we went back for dinner that Saturday evening, and we had bologna sandwiches in front of the television, and we watched the space shuttle take off. And my grandfather lived through that transition from 10,000-year-old animal, beast of burden agriculture to the space age. My children kind of know what a space shuttle is because they saw the last one retired from service. So my children are seeing change that's even more dramatic than my grandfather saw. We're living through this information technology age, and I left my cell phone down there so it wouldn't interfere with the microphone. I'd hold that up and tell you that technology is transforming the world in ways we don't understand. Let's go back to my grandfather's era. My grandfather was born in the 20th century. He was born in a time of czars, emperors, kings. The rulers of the planet, the rulers of humanity were monarchs. That was just the way of the world. Just the way we had a couple of experiments in democracy, including the United States, that were questionable in their success at that time. Then we had this event that occurred with a halftime interlude called World Wars I and II. That event transformed the world in a period of 25 years, transformed the world political stage, so now we're in full-fledged the era of democracy. We've seen the Arab Spring emerge, largely because now that technology allows for people to congregate independent of and reach each other without the control of government. So now we're seeing a transformation. So our children are seeing this dramatic shift in their political reality. And for my children, I have 13-year-old twins, for them this is just the way it is. Things change that fast. For those of us who remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, this is not fast change. I mean, this is not acceptable change. This is transformational for us. We are having trouble dealing with this rate of change. And what we typically do when we can't understand something is we ignore it. That's the way we adapt for it. We kind of let it blend away. We do that at our own peril. And I'll bring this back home to our industry and sustainability, because what sustainability allows us to do is to think about change in a way that allows us to understand it, to measure it, and adapt to it. By the way, you see that little 2100, you see that drop-off? That's not a Mel Gibson apocalyptic post-nuclear globe. What that represents is an indication of the hope for humanity, our most prosperous possible outcome, and it may happen at 2075 instead of 2100, which is we reach population zero. How many of you have more than 4 siblings? How many of your grandparents have more than 4 siblings? How many of your great-grandparents have more than 4 siblings? So what's wrong with you guys? How many of you have more than 4 kids? Oh, look, one hand. You see now, why is that? Do we not like children? No, we're more prosperous. And what happens when women become more prosperous? Yes, when women become more prosperous, and I'm a man, so I say this with all trepidation, but when women become more prosperous, they say no. They say they control their biology, and they invest more in the children they have. Why do people have 12? Why did our great-grandparents have 12 kids? Because infant mortality was high, and because so the number that would live past 5, we might lose 20% before they hit 5 years of age, and because we needed those kids to work the farm. The economic unit was the farm, the family farm, and that was the labor force. So that's why we had kids. We don't need those kids to work the farm anymore. And let me tell you, if we do, we're doomed. My kids can't work. I don't know about yours. So this represents what happens when we empower women. We can reach population zero, which means that we're not a growing population anymore. Now, I understand there are a few economists in the room, and it's going to be for the economists to tell us how we can have a growing economy with a decreasing population. I'm an engineer. I deal with more simple things. So, the time of our children and grandchildren, the 21st century, moving to the 22nd century, is going to be different than today. That's the great American philosophy, Yogi Berra, said, the problem with predicting the future is it ain't happened yet. The problem we have with predicting the future is it's going to happen, and we'd better be able to predict it if we're going to stay prosperous in our enterprise, regardless of what our enterprise is. That's the essence of sustainability. Let's zoom in a little bit to this population conundrum. Again, you heard a little bit about my mentor, Norman Borlaug, a hero of mine, father of the Green Revolution, a humble a man of Norwegian descent who would have rather stayed home and farmed but couldn't because he couldn't make money at it. And so he said he went out and fed 2 billion people. He and a whole army of other agricultural scientists and around the world brought modern technology to the world. What Norman said when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, the Nobel Peace Prize, the only agronomist ever to receive it, the only agricultural scientist to ever receive it. When he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, he said, "We have only won a battle against hunger, but the war against the population monster looms on. We are at risk of losing all of our gains if we do not engage in reducing the population." And he taught me through all of the years that we were able to work, that I had the honor to work at his heels, he taught me that prosperity is what reduces population. I have a lot of my friends in environmental and ecological groups who think that we shouldn't have fed that 1.5 billion people. They should have starved to death, and that would have been better for our human population. I'll be polite and say horse hockey. That's just absolutely, first of all, let's think about what that statement implies. It implies that we do not care about humanity. It implies that it is okay to throw 1.5 billion people off the lifeboat Earth and let them die because they have brown skin and brown eyes, because that's the truth. That's what that says. Now, I reject that at its core, and I won't be a part of that kind of ideology. What we have to do is articulate the more hopeful and positive ideology, which is we're all in this together. We survive or we die together as a species. And the way we do that is by understanding that our common prosperity gives us the opportunity to make life better for everything on the planet, including the non-human living things. And that's a point coming later, too. So without change, we're looking at 12 billion by 2050. Well, we're changing. So the median population adjustment is about 9 billion, but UN estimates actually in 2012 with the global recession bumped that up to about 10 billion. We don't know where we're going to be in 40 years, but I can tell you what we do in the next 10 years will determine that, because the mothers of those children are either born now or will be born in the next 5 years. So what we do now will determine what happens to humanity in the next 10 to 20 or 50 years. Now, I say this to corporations all around the world. If you want to do something as an organization to save humanity, to make life better for people 2 generations from now, educate women. Educate women, educate women. And I don't say empower women, because it's not, I can't empower women. Women empower themselves. But they need the fundamental foundational tools of empowerment, and education is that tool. I can damn well guarantee you if you educate women, they will empower themselves. So, the other challenge we have is this technology. We've been talking about that all morning and a bit yesterday. When technology and culture collide, technology always prevails. My Native American ancestors scrambled to get iron tools because Stone Age tools were the best they had, and an iron knife was a whole lot better, and let me tell you, a gun was a miracle. Here's the other reality. Those 2.5 billion folks coming to dinner, they're not coming from around here. They're coming from other places. They're coming from the developing economies. I have a little retailer up the road from me in northwest Arkansas called Walmart, and they recognize that the same store sales have been relatively flat in the United States and in their developed markets for the last 4 or 5 years. They're doing okay, frankly, but they're not growing like they used to. Where they're seeing their biggest sales are in their emerging markets. That's where they're moving. If you're in the business of selling animal protein and you're not looking at that next set of customers, that's not very smart of you. That's where your customers are coming from, because they're going to be the most prosperous people on the planet as a whole. We're going to see the most prosperous humanity we've ever seen. They're going to want to buy good quality animal protein. They don't want to eat rice and fish heads all day long. Now, elements of sustainable agriculture. Let's talk about what we're describing. This is the standard Venn diagram of sustainability. We all understand that environmental sustainability is sort of the big hallmark, but really it's not about environmental only. Environmental is only a small part, because people profit are core to sustainability as well. In order to have an equitable, prosperous humanity, we have to have a profitable enterprise system. We have to. And we also need the resources, the ecosystem services, to make the life bearable for people and also viable for profit. The sweet spots where they all collide. And that's what we're looking at, sustainability. But we've got to be able to measure this. We have to quantify it in objective terms so that we can communicate these processes. Because here's our other challenge. There's just no more earth left for increased cultivation. We already use 43% of Earth's surface if you include grazing and pasture land for agricultural production. The only arable land left, the place with water, based upon our current understanding of climate, is really in Brazil, in the tropical areas of South America, Central America, as well as in Asia and in Africa. But the only uncultivated areas are predominantly in South America and Africa. So that means if you're buying non-GM soy in Europe, what you're buying is rainforest destruction. Because that's what you have to have in order to produce non-GM soy in Brazil. You have to bulldoze the rainforest in order to and grow the first 4 or 5 seasons of crops before weed and disease pressure increase enough that you can't sustain that crop anymore, and you have to move to GM. So the first couple of your products of slash and burn agriculture in the Brazilian rainforest are going to Europe so that they don't have to eat GM food. I work with the World Wildlife Fund. Jason Clay is the Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs in the United States. He says there are persistent issues in sustainability and important issues. The persistent issues are locally grown, GMO, organic, and natural. But they don't matter when it comes to sustainability. What matters are water use efficiency, soil erosion, soil organic carbon, land use change, biodiversity loss. Those are the things that matter. Now, in sustainability science, we would call those key performance indicators. Those are indicators of things we care about. What Jason also says is that we have to freeze the footprint of agriculture if we're going to have other living things on the planet. Tigers, panda bears, lion tamarins. Those are the big marketable wildlife of concern. But it goes way beyond that, those ecosystem services. He says in order to do that, the role of research is key. We have to freeze the footprint of agriculture, which means intensification. Intensification of animal and crop agriculture. This is from a conservation organization, the biggest conservation organization on the planet, and the most influential. But the role of research is a problem because in the United States, we've decided at some level over the last 20 years that it's not that important to invest in agricultural research. Now, admittedly, I get money from the federal government to support agricultural research. So this is a bit self-serving. But I can tell you that the real level of funding for agricultural research has been declining to flatline for the last 25 years from the federal government. It's the private sector that's kept us moving forward. Thank God for the private sector. Without them, we would not be making progress. So here are the key challenges. In order to meet the projected demand, and by the way, these slides will be available to all of you folks on the webpage, so you can use those for NIAA. So you can use these however you see fit. I'm a university employee. Everything I do is public, and I've cited, I think, most of the relevant information here. Email me if you have any questions. In order to meet projected demands for food, feed, and agriculture, we've got to increase yield 50 to 100%. The fact is, it's probably the global north is going to have most of the opportunity, it's not burden, opportunity to produce that food. So that means we're going to have to double in the global north, Europe and U.S. predominantly. We're going to have to double our production in order to meet that increasing demand. If we want to preserve biodiversity and other land-based ecosystem services upon which we all depend, we must freeze the footprint of agriculture. Yield must more than double. Energy scarcity is going to drive innovation. It already is. John Deere and other traction manufacturer companies, equipment companies, have incredible technologies for idling and for torque demand control for fuel. Incredible fuel efficiency improvements over the last 5 years. And frankly, with the GM crop, it's not unusual to only have to make 4 or 5 passes across a field from planting or tillage to harvest, if you even till at all anymore. In England, some of my colleagues had the opportunity to meet with a producer in southern Scotland who was very excited about his field. He'd made an adoption to his discs so that he only had to make 14 passes on his field to produce a crop. 14 passes. We politely smiled. So, energy scarcity will drive innovation. Water scarcity will limit global productivity. Water is expensive and hard to move. Here's our problem with food supply chain. From production to consumption, we have not that many complex steps, but people don't trust us anymore because the safety, security, and stability of our supply chain has been brought into question. So if we look at the various sustainability initiatives, what we're trying to do is we're trying to also not just communicate to the agricultural community, but also to the consumer community. Field to Market Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture is a group I work with. I think it's the most progressive group in the United States for agricultural production. They're predominantly focused on row crops, but animal agriculture is emerging as a new network. The FAO, Stewardship for Index for Specialty Crops, UN Foundation, Sustainability Consortium, which is a Walmart funded group. There are a number of sustainability initiatives in the United States that are driving these metrics. We want to make sure these metrics are science-based and not ideological. But our issue is trust, because what we have are consumer attitudes, social license, freedom to operate, major issue with animal agriculture, criteria for legitimacy, market competitiveness, and from the retailer's perspective, it's all about reputational risk. It's bad for business to sell products that kill your customers. That's what Lee Scott, former CEO of Walmart, said. Just bad for business. I have the opportunity to work for the Center for Food Integrity as well, out of Chicago, an incredible group. Charlie Arnott leads this group. This is an organization that is also helping to define the principal criteria that help to drive trust. And what they point out is that shared values really are what tip the balance in people understanding what you're talking about. The reason I started talking to you about my grandfather is because you need to know who I am and where I came from. Because you're not going to understand my passions or what I'm telling you, and you're not going to trust me if you don't understand at least a little bit about who I am or where I come from. Let me tell you, in the United States, the people who buy your products don't know who you are or where you come from. And they don't trust you because they don't think you share their values. How do you build trust? You build it through confidence, competency, influential others. But it's all about values. And we have to get better at communicating that. Now, the work I do is in metrics for sustainability. I work on the competence angle of this. I don't work on the shared values area. But if you do not move to shared values, you're going to lose the debate over trust. Here's what I do. Sustainability is continuous improvement. In industry in the 70s and 60s, we called it total quality management, TQM. This is a process where you define your goals, measure your outcomes, and implement strategies. It's not complicated. It's like loving your neighbor. I said this yesterday. It's hard to use jokes twice, but I'm a university professor. I tell the same jokes 3 times a day. It's like loving your neighbor. It's not complicated. It's just hard. And that's what we have here. Define sustainability for the enterprise. Define key performance indicators. Select metrics for those key performance indicators. Measure those key performance indicators. Set goals. Develop a strategy to meet those goals. Do this all transparently. Do this with stakeholders who disagree with you, but who will give you credibility in that trust measure area. Implement the strategy, measure, assess, and report results, adapt the strategy to improve outcomes. We've been working with the National Port Board to do just this, and right now we're at the benchmarks for KPIs and setting goals stage for the National Port Board, working with NGOs and other groups. Sustainable agriculture, a lot of folks say, well, you can't really define it. Yeah, you can. It's really not that hard to define. Let me give you a definition. Please quote this definition. This is the field to market definition, but it's a modification of the Brundtland Report from 1968. Meeting the needs of the present while improving the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Now, the original Brundtland Commission definition for sustainable development was meeting the needs of the present without hindering the ability of future generations to meet their needs. We don't think that's good enough. We're agricultural producers. We're people of the land. We leave the wood stack a little taller. So increasing productivity to meet future needs and fiber demand, feed food, fuel, and fiber, improving the environment, improving social and economic well-being of our agricultural communities. How many of you live in agricultural communities? How many of you have more students graduating high school this year than 20 years ago? Some of you. How many of you have less? That's the more common experience across our ag communities. We're losing our kids because we're losing our population. How many of those kids do you think are going to stay home and work? Well, how many of you have jobs for them? In Arkansas, our greatest export are our children. I grew up in Oklahoma, 8th-generation kids. My kids now see Oklahoma as a quaint place to go visit their grandparents. They'll never live there. I live in Arkansas, northwest Arkansas. I am doomed to have to get on an airplane to see my grandkids because I choose to live in a relatively rural agricultural state. My daughter's at Purdue. She's studying aerospace engineering. She's not going to work in Arkansas. Framework for goals. Goals are not simple, like loving your neighbor. They're not simple. Goals have a taxonomy. We need to understand this to communicate to folks that it is not appropriate for NGOs to tell farmers what their operational goals are. What is appropriate for NGOs to do is to work with farmers to understand what our common aspirational and strategic goals are. We all agree that soil erosion is bad. Our aspirational goal is that we will have no soil erosion. An aspirational goal is that there will be no bacterial contamination of water from animal agricultural production. Those are aspirational goals. Then we can put strategic goals that actually have numbers in them, and those are vision level goals that belong to the stakeholder community writ large. And we should agree on those. If we want to have a truly innovative agricultural community, though, we have to draw a line and say that the tactical and operational goals belong to the producers and the producer communities. Because we know, they know how best to implement. Now, just having that simple graph allows you to communicate with the World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, or other NGOs who are reasonable and rational and say, let's agree on these things and let's defer those decisions to the people who know best how to make them that will move us towards these goals. Now we have common agreement instead of fighting, and instead of an NGO saying everyone has to use this practice on the land because this practice is sustainable, whether it's organic or whether it's biochar or pick your practice. And you know, those practices may work in some circumstances, or they may be better in most circumstances. I'm a big proponent of conservation tillage practices. I'm a child of the Dust Bowl, or grandchild of the Dust Bowl. I believe that conservation practices are inherently better than our older practices of deep tilling. But sometimes practices have to be appropriate to the conditions of the day. And sometimes disease pressure and weed pressure demands the other. That's where we get into operational goals. So what we should do is agree that our key performance indicators should be outcomes-based, not ideologically based. They should be science-driven, not ideologically driven. Technology neutral. I'm not a cheerleader for biotechnology. I'm a cheerleader for sustainable outcomes. And if biotechnology gets there, I celebrate it. It's a tool in our toolbox. Let's not take the tools in our toolbox at this point of where we are going to have to double our production. Let's not take critical tools out and throw them on the ground, which was what we did with BSG and dairy production. And they have to be transparent. We have to open the doors and show people what we're doing. What Temple Grandin says is absolutely correct. And I will quote her. This is a quote from Temple Grandin. Stop the bullshit. When you have a problem on the farm, kick open the barn doors and show people. That's absolutely the wisest advice you can ever hear. Now, environmental key performance indicators for agriculture, we've got common agreement. Greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, water use, land use, water quality, nutrient efficiency, and habitat biodiversity. We can agree on those things. Let's get on with measuring them. But let's talk about what a key performance indicator is versus a metric. A key performance indicator is something you care about. A metric is what you can measure. Because you can't always measure what you care about. That's the science and engineer in me. I was in South Africa a year ago at the Global Food and Feed Congress, and I got to go on a safari, my first ever, and it transformed my life. So I took a picture of this giraffe. Now before this, there were about 5 giraffes down in a river riparian area with a bunch of zebras and gazelles. And we sat and watched them for about 2 hours. The giraffe's ears perked up and they came walking up towards us. We're just off the road from this giraffe. And the zebras and gazelles, when these giraffes' ears came up and they started walking this way, guess what the zebras and gazelles did? They went the other way. Why? Where? You can't see them? They're in the picture. That's the whole point. The giraffes are the sentinels of the thing that's apparent to anyone who knows it's there, but unless you know it's there, you can't see it. See them now? See, they're over on the very far left-hand side, about a third of the way up. They're there. The giraffe could see them, and there are 5 lions sitting there. They're young lions, the type that are stupid enough to go after a giraffe. And let me tell you, that giraffe was gravid at the time, was obviously pregnant. She was standing there and she watched them and she stared them down. She stared them down. They got out of their shade and moved on. So again, that's the toughness of women. So, Human Water Security Threat Index. Water is everything. So we have to pay attention to water because where those people are coming from, that's where we're also going to have water shortages. Agriculture producers have to pay attention to this. Just to remind you, water use efficiency is one of the first things that World Wildlife Fund cares about. It's the first thing because it affects everything else that they deal with too in conservation of wildlife. Now we have some challenges because the people who are telling the story sometimes get it wrong, including the FAO. We have some challenges because we don't tell the story strong enough. And I'm going to flip through this fairly quickly just so you know. But the argument is that livestock greenhouse gas emissions are about 7.1 gigatons on the planet. It's 14% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions globally. We can quibble over whether that's right or wrong. The question is what knobs can we turn to affect it? Potentially increasing forage digestibility and will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they say, from rumen fermentation of stored manure, dietary lipids, supplements. Increasing food efficiency intake, which is, I think, one of the things you guys talk about. Increasing food use efficiency is a critical variable. To look at the litany of animal agriculture where they identify the problems, it's really in dairy cattle and beef cattle. That's really where the big knobs are. Pigs and chickens, not so much. So here's what Field to Market's been doing. This is a whole group of people from across the supply chain. We're talking about everyone from National Corn Growers Association, Dairy Resource Institute, to Walmart, Bunge, Cargill, a couple of land-grant universities, including University of Arkansas. What we've been doing is mapping key performance indicators for U.S. agriculture, predominantly crop agriculture, across the United States for the last 25 years, using objective, transparent data. And what we're seeing is that we're making dramatic improvements in soil erosion. These radar diagrams are benchmarked to 2000, so everything that gets smaller is less than 2000. If it's less than 1, it's less than 2000. The green line is the benchmark year of 2000. You can see with soil erosion, we've made dramatic improvements. With greenhouse gas emissions and energy use, which are parallel to each other, we've made dramatic improvements. We work with a number of other organizations. BEEF is working with BSA to develop their life cycle assessments to do the same sort of work. There's an ISO standard for this, so we're working within the context of a larger scientific community, this scientifically approved process. Life cycle assessment is simply an accounting process with goal, scope, definition, inventory analysis, impact assessment, interpretation. Again, we have standard methods that we comply with. So let's talk about this process, because you need to have at least the language of life cycle assessment. Everything we do, everything human endeavor can be broken into a subset of human processes, of unit processes, with inputs from other processes and outputs to other processes. Inputs from nature, outputs to nature we'd call waste. So you take two raw materials, and let's say milk and chocolate, and we want to make chocolate milk. There are a whole bunch of steps in between to make the milk and to make the chocolate that can lead to the chocolate milk. And you can see that those unit processes can be divided, be as big as small as you want to divide them, and they all have boundaries. And those boundaries matter for comparability. And this is a standardization of accounting process that we're engaged with. I work with the National Ag Library under the USDA to try to develop standardized processes for these life cycle assessments, because the boundaries matter for comparability. Also, we have an allocation problem. Chicken, for example, if we want to evaluate how much greenhouse gas is emitted or water is used for a kilogram of chicken, do we do it by mass? Tyson right now is working on that three-breasted chicken, by the way. That's something they're working on. So, yeah. So do we do it by mass? Well, we don't raise that chicken. We raise this chicken, and there's a lot of other stuff. And that other stuff has value too. And as one of my the companies I work with, Mars Corporation, would tell you that stuff used to be cheap, and they didn't want to have to pay on a pound basis. They didn't want to have greenhouse gases allocated to offal and beaks or heads and feet and feathers, because they use that for pet feed. So they wanted that instead of by mass, but by economic valuation. And both of those are allowed. But you have to have rules to know when you do economic or mass allocation. For example, we're working with the pork industry on water footprint, and we're struggling with dry distillers grains, which are a byproduct of making ethanol. So who gets the burden of growing the corn when you feed dry distiller grains to pigs? Is it the pigs or is it the ethanol? Well, there's a process for divvying that up, and we've developed that and standardized that process. So we're benchmarking this process for the pork industry, and what we find is that the carbon footprint for a 14-ounce serving of pork is about 2.4 pounds of CO2. That's about, that's competitive with the global average. This is one of those bits of data that's useful for reporting, but useless for management, because no one's going to manage their practice based upon greenhouse gas emissions. But if we start looking about where those greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, sow barn really isn't a big one. Nursery to finish is where most of it is, because it's the feed and manure, processing, packaging, retail, consumers. What we find is that it's coming from the feed and manure. And we should be paying attention to that, because greenhouse gas emissions also mean energy loss, mass loss, carbon loss to methane instead of to the animal. So this represents an opportunity for increased efficiency, also for decreased impact. And there may become a time when greenhouse gas emissions do matter to our producers. So this is, again, the science of this, but it also allows us to compare practices. So we compared a whole suite of practices to see what they did to greenhouse gas, water, energy, using the same tools. Removal of antibiotics to prevent disease and promote growth. That's an example. So if we take antibiotics out of the pork production system, so we don't give antimicrobials in order to prevent disease or promote growth, guess what happens to the greenhouse gas? That's the big bar at the top, in the middle. You almost double greenhouse gas emissions, increase it by about 60%. The reason is because infant mortality of the pigs, the piglet mortality goes up. And you've got a lot invested in that pig before it dies. And you also have a slight decrease in growth. Same thing with water. So the science of sustainability tells us that the preventative use of antimicrobials is valuable for sustainability metrics. There may be other reasons to take them out of this production system to remove that practice, but we should do it with the full knowledge of the consequences of that decision. We shouldn't do it blindly because someone says it's good, because there's an advocacy group that advocates for it. Maybe even the science says we should take them out because of potential for microbial resistance or antibiotic resistance in the system. And okay, there's a rational argument. And maybe ultimately in the risk management balance, taking them out wins. But we do it with the full knowledge of the consequence, other than blindly because the market tells us to. So we looked at water in pigs, and we see that it takes between 19 and 144 gallons of water to produce a pound of boneless pork. 75% of that's from feed, 20% is from drinking water. So on the farm, it's not that much. Mostly it's in the feed, but once you get on the farm, it's all the drinking water. So if those nipple cups are leaking a little bit, you're driving up your water bill, but you're also driving up the water footprint, and you're also adding water to your waste system. And so a little bit of management has big consequences. Again, we look at herd size or regionality. We can start analyzing and seeing there's really no difference in our efficiency of herd size across our metrics or in where you're producing, which region you're producing in, whether it's region 1 or region 10. There's variability, but it's all in the noise. The science tells us then that small producers are not disadvantaged over large producers in these metrics, that the economies of scale are economic, they're not ecological. And that's valuable information to have. So as we look at the sustainability framework, and I'm bringing it on home here, folks, where we are in most of our systems is we're at this setting goals for KPIs. We all understand, and we can agree on these key performance indicators for the environment. We have to develop social and economic goals. The economic goals, profitability, obviously, among others. Profitability for the producer and for the community, and we can start listing a number of those. But we need to start developing goals as agricultural producer communities, proclaiming those goals, showing how we're working to meet those goals, and engaging the community to understand the consumer community, to understand our strategies for implementing those goals, celebrating our strengths of our past, and making it clear to folks that our goals, that we own the tactical and operational goals on the farm, that we share the setting of strategic and aspirational goals with our larger consumer community. Thank you.